Security guard blocks Beggar from meeting Baron Trump. What Barron does next shocks everyone. While dining at a high-end restaurant, Baron Trump notices a beggar trying to approach him for help. However, his security guard steps in to block the interaction, escalating the situation. What Barron does next leaves the entire restaurant stunned and delivers a powerful message about compassion and humanity. Witness this jaw-dropping moment of kindness and courage. Don't miss the shocking twist that will leave you inspired. Like, comment from which country you are watching, and subscribe for more stories that challenge and move you. The soft hum of conversation filled the luxurious dining room of La Royale, a restaurant known for its exclusivity and elegance. The chandeliers cast a golden glow on the carefully set tables, where the city's elite enjoyed their meals. Among them sat Baron Trump, poised and quiet, his tall frame commanding subtle attention from the diners nearby. With two security guards stationed discreetly behind him, Barron seemed unbothered by the whispers that often accompanied his presence. Barron was midway through his meal when the restaurant's heavy glass doors swung open, drawing the attention of the staff and a few curious diners. A man stepped inside, his clothes worn and his face marked with exhaustion. The man's hands were clasped together, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of desperation and determination. "Excuse me," he said softly to a nearby server, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room. "I need to speak with Mr. Trump. Please, it's important." The server hesitated, unsure how to handle the situation, and glanced nervously at the security guards. The larger of the two guards, a stern-faced man named Rick, quickly intercepted the beggar, his voice firm. "You're not allowed to disturb Mr. Trump," he said, blocking the man's path. "This is private property. You need to leave." The beggar held his ground, his voice trembling but resolute. "Please," he said, his eyes pleading. "I just need a minute of his time. That's all." Rick stepped forward, his imposing frame towering over the man. "I said leave," he repeated, his tone growing colder. A few diners turned to watch, their curiosity piqued as the tension in the room began to build. Barron, initially unaware of the commotion, glanced up from his plate when he noticed the growing whispers around him. His sharp eyes immediately found the source of the disturbance. The beggar, standing with his hands still clasped, facing off against his guard. For a moment, Barron's expression remained unreadable. Then, with a subtle gesture, he signaled Rick to stop. The guard hesitated but stepped aside reluctantly, his jaw tightening as Barron rose from his seat. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Barron approached the beggar, his movements calm but deliberate. He stopped just a few feet away, his hands resting casually in his pockets. "You needed to see me?" Barron asked, his voice steady but curious. The man nodded quickly, his eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I wouldn't bother you if it wasn't important." Barron studied the man for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "All right," he said simply. "Let's hear it." The tension in the room shifted as the diners and staff watched, their curiosity growing by the second. No one could have predicted what was about to unfold, or how Barron's response would leave everyone in the restaurant stunned. The beggar's hands trembled slightly as he took a deep breath, his voice raw with emotion. "Thank you for hearing me out, sir," he began, his eyes darting nervously toward the watchful security guards. "My name is Matthew. I'm not here to cause trouble." Barron nodded slightly, his calm demeanor encouraging Matthew to continue. "Go on," he said, his tone steady. Matthew hesitated, his gaze dropping to the polished floor for a moment. "I lost my job a few months ago," he said, his voice breaking. "Since then, it's been one thing after another. My landlord kicked me out, my savings are gone, and now my daughter is sick. She needs treatment I can't afford." The room grew quieter as diners leaned closer to hear the man's words. Even the staff, who had tried to remain discreet, couldn't help but watch. The desperation in Matthew's voice was impossible to ignore. "I know I shouldn't be here," Matthew continued, his voice trembling. "I've tried every option, asked for help everywhere I could think of, but no one would listen. I saw you here tonight, Mr. Trump, and I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd hear me out." Barron stood still, his expression unreadable as Matthew finished speaking. The man's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of his plea had drained what little energy he had left. I just need enough to get her started on treatment, Matthew said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's all I'm asking. Rick, the head security guard, took a step forward, his tone curt. This is not the place for this, he said firmly. You've made your point. It's time to leave. But Barron raised a hand, stopping Rick in his tracks. Hold on, he said quietly, his gaze never leaving Matthew. Let him finish. Matthew looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Please, he said softly, I'll pay you back. Every penny. Just give me a chance. The room seemed frozen, every eye fixed on Barron as he considered the man's words. A faint whisper rippled through the diners, their curiosity mingled with judgment. Some muttered about the disruption, while others exchanged glances of pity. Finally, Barron broke the silence. You're asking for help for your daughter? He said, his voice calm but firm. Matthew nodded quickly, his hands clasped tightly together. Yes, sir. She's only 6. She doesn't deserve to suffer because of my mistakes. Barron's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. All right, he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced the whispers around them. Let's talk about this. He gestured toward an empty table in the corner of the restaurant. Sit down, Barron said, surprising everyone in the room. Tell me everything. The collective gasp from the diners was almost audible as Matthew hesitated, then nodded, his voice cracking. Thank you, he whispered. As the two made their way to the table, Rick exchanged a confused glance with the other guard, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing, standing stiffly by Barron's original seat. The restaurant buzzed with anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Whatever Barron Trump was about to do, it was clear it wouldn't be ordinary, and it would leave a mark on everyone who witnessed it. Matthew sat nervously at the table, his hands clutching the edge as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Across from him, Barron sat with an air of calm, his posture straight and composed, but his gaze steady and focused. The hum of whispers in the restaurant had grown quieter, the other diners now pretending not to watch, though their curiosity was palpable. Start from the beginning, Barron said, his tone firm but not unkind. Tell me what happened. Matthew took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly as he began. I was working at a factory just outside the city, he said. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep my family afloat. Then the layoff started. I thought I'd be safe. I'd been there for years, but they let me go without a second thought. Barron leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Matthew. And after that? He asked. Matthew swallowed hard. I tried to find another job, but nothing stuck. Bills started piling up, and before I knew it, we were evicted. I've been doing odd jobs here and there, but it's not enough. And now, his voice broke, and he looked down, ashamed. Now my daughter's sick. The doctors say it's treatable, but the costs are more than I could ever hope to afford. Barron remained silent for a moment, his gaze never wavering. The weight of Matthew's story hung heavily in the air, the quiet hum of the restaurant amplifying the raw emotion in his words. What kind of treatment does she need? Barron asked finally, his voice calm but sharp, cutting through the tension. Matthew hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, sliding it across the table. Here, he said, it's a breakdown of the costs. I've been saving every penny I can, but I'm nowhere close. Barron unfolded the paper, scanning it briefly. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Empathy, perhaps, or recognition of a struggle he'd never personally faced but could still understand. And you came here, Barron said slowly, setting the paper down, because you thought I'd help. Matthew nodded, his voice barely audible. You're my last hope. Across the room, Rick shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed as he watched the exchange. The other diners were riveted, their meals forgotten as they waited to see what Barron would do next. After a long pause, Barron leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. Do you know how many people approach me with stories like this? He asked, his tone firm but not harsh. Do you have any idea how many try to use me, thinking I'm just a name with a blank check attached? Matthew flinched slightly, his face reddening. I'm not trying to use you, he said quickly, his voice cracking. I don't know where else to turn. Barron studied him for a moment longer. The room so quiet that even the clinking of a fork seemed loud. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll help." Matthew's eyes widened, disbelief and relief washing over him all at once. "You will?" he whispered. Barron nodded, his expression softening slightly. "But not just for your daughter," he said. "We'll talk more after dinner. For now, sit tight." Matthew sat back, his hands trembling as tears welled in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." As Barron rose from the table and returned to his seat, the restaurant buzzed with hushed whispers. Rick leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Barron glanced at him, his tone calm but resolute. "Absolutely," he said. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk." The tension in the room shifted, the diners watching Barron with a newfound respect. But the night wasn't over yet. What Barron had planned would leave everyone, including Matthew, completely stunned. As the restaurant buzzed with quiet anticipation, Barron sat back at his table, seemingly calm but deep in thought. Matthew remained seated at the corner, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he glanced nervously around the room. For the first time in a long while, hope flickered within him, though he couldn't shake the doubt that lingered. Barron signaled Rick, his head of security, to come closer. "I want you to call our legal team," he said quietly, his tone firm but composed. "I'll need them to work on something for Matthew." Rick's brow furrowed. "A donation, sir?" he asked, unsure. Barron shook his head slightly. "Not just that," he said. "I don't want to just give him money and walk away. We're going to give him a chance to stand back up on his own." Rick hesitated, then nodded, pulling out his phone to make the call. Meanwhile, Barron turned his gaze back toward Matthew, who had been trying, and failing, to avoid the curious stares of the other diners. With a small gesture, Barron invited him back to his table. As Matthew approached, Barron motioned for him to sit. "Listen," Barron began, his tone calm but carrying authority. "I'm going to cover your daughter's medical costs. All of it. You won't owe me anything." Matthew's breath hitched, his eyes widening with disbelief. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron nodded. "Completely," he said. "But that's not all." Matthew blinked, unsure of what Barron meant. "Not all?" he repeated, confused. Barron leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "I've got a friend who owns a factory," he said. "He's been looking for someone reliable, someone willing to work hard. I'll call him tonight and make sure there's a spot for you. This isn't just about helping you survive. It's about giving you a shot to rebuild." Matthew stared at Barron, his lips trembling as he struggled to process the words. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "You don't even know me. Why would you do this?" Barron's expression softened, and for the first time, a hint of vulnerability flickered in his eyes. "Because I can," he said simply. "And because sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the weight of Barron's words settling over everyone present. The diners, who had initially been curious onlookers, now sat in quiet admiration, their respect for Barron evident in their expressions. Matthew lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as silent tears streamed down his face. "Thank you," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Barron gave him a small nod, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Go back to your daughter," he said. "She needs you more than anything else right now. And don't worry, my team will take care of everything." Matthew stood slowly, his legs shaky but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. "I'll never forget this," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've changed our lives." Barron watched him leave, his face thoughtful. The diners began murmuring softly, their whispers carrying a mix of admiration and reflection. But Barron wasn't done yet. His next move would cement the night as unforgettable for everyone in the room. As Matthew exited the restaurant, wiping tears from his eyes, the room settled into a reflective hush. Barron Trump sat quietly for a moment, his gaze following Matthew's retreating figure. Then, with a calm authority, he stood and addressed the restaurant, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "I know most of you saw what just happened," Barron began, his tone steady but charged with meaning. And I know some of you might think what I did was unnecessary, but here's the truth. Sometimes we all need a hand to get back on our feet. The diners watched in rapt silence, their eyes fixed on Barron as he continued. It's easy to judge someone like Matthew, he said, to assume his struggles are his fault or that he doesn't deserve a second chance. But that's not who we should be. Kindness isn't about who deserves it. It's about choosing to give it anyway. The room seemed to hang on his every word, the weight of his message settling over everyone. Barron's gaze swept across the room, his sharp eyes meeting those of the staff and diners alike. Tonight wasn't about me helping one man, he said. It's about reminding all of us that we can do better. We can be better. The crowd erupted into soft applause, their admiration for Barron evident in their expressions. Even Rick, the stoic security guard, gave a subtle nod of approval. But Barron wasn't finished. He turned toward the restaurant's manager, a woman who had been standing near the kitchen, her hands clasped nervously. I want to cover every table's bill tonight, Barron said, his voice steady. And I want every member of the staff to get a bonus. You've all worked hard and it hasn't gone unnoticed. The manager's jaw dropped slightly, and the staff exchanged stunned glances. Are you sure, sir? The manager asked, her voice shaky. Barron nodded firmly. Completely, he said. Consider it my way of thanking you for your hard work and for showing compassion. The restaurant erupted into applause, louder this time, as the diners cheered Barron's generosity. The staff, many of whom had watched the earlier interaction with Matthew unfold, beamed with gratitude, their spirits lifted. As Barron prepared to leave, Rick stepped forward. You didn't have to do all that, sir, he said quietly, his usual stern demeanor softening. Barron gave him a faint smile. I know, he said, but sometimes doing what you don't have to is what makes the biggest difference. With that, Barron turned and exited the restaurant, leaving behind a room full of people who had been touched by his actions. For the diners, it was a night they'd tell stories about for years. For the staff, it was a reminder that their work mattered. And for Matthew, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, dignity, and the chance to rebuild. As the door swung shut behind him, Barron walked into the cool night air, his expression calm but thoughtful. He didn't need recognition or applause. For him, the real victory was knowing he'd made a difference. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful moments of kindness and humanity. Stay tuned for more stories that leave you thinking and uplift your spirit.